Well, good afternoon, everybody. Harry Schreier with you live, St. Louis, Missouri, ValleyHoopsInsider.com. Glad to be with you today. It is Selection Show Friday. What I mean is Sunday, we have the big selection show, and today we're going to talk a little bit about bracketology, how the teams are getting in, where they're getting seated, why they're getting seated, with our great friend and expert in the field, Rocco Miller from Bracketeer.org. We bring him into the conversation. Rocco, you're like swamped these days, everything going crazy. And I called you up and said, hey, let's do a show. And you said, why not? So yeah, I appreciate you joining us today. And I just want to talk about a number of things. But for the people that visit our site, we are a site that cover mid-major basketball in general, the Missouri Valley and Ohio Valley conferences in specific. And we like to whine because we have all these teams that are so good and they're deserving of whatever. But before so we campaign and we fight and all that. Tell me this before we break down to kind of a little bit into what you do and where we see some of these teams going. When I look at the new thing, the net used to be the RPI and different things, but the net seems to be the kind of the gold standard these days. Is there kind of a number in the net? Like if you're above X, you just ain't getting in, barring winning your conference tournament.
I think it's easy to slip into that mentality. I do my best not to, because I do think the net has more variables than the old RPI did. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, we had two teams in the mid-20s or higher. That would be West Virginia and Utah State. And I thought in that moment in time, if we had to select a bracket, neither of them were really deserving of selection for very different reasons. West Virginia had just way too many losses and they didn't have the wins to outweigh them. They eventually got those. So if you're a Mountaineer fan, don't worry, you're going to be fine. And then from Utah State's standpoint, I think this has been well discussed, nationally. They don't have a win in that top quadrant. I'm not even trying to focus on the quadrants that much either. For me, it's about beating teams that are going to be in the tournament. And Utah State got, the win against Boise at home. They got the win against Oral Roberts, who will be in the tournament, but they didn't get any of those away from home, and they have a huge home court advantage. So very debatable for them to be in. Now they've gotten some help this week, and their numbers just keep skyrocketing. I think their net is number 18 today, which is just insane. But it tells me that we probably won't see it this year, because I do think those two teams will get in. That one of these years we're going to see a team ranked as high as maybe 25 not get in, just because theoretically you could go out if you have a 30-game schedule, you could blow. If you go 15-15 and your 15 wins, you blow teams out every time, and you lose heartbreakers in all your losses. You're still not a winning enough team to get in, but your net could be phenomenal. So. I'm not trying to get too dead set on a certain benchmark, but obviously the NCAA owns the net tool, and I think there's a lot of credence to, if you have an extreme team like Wisconsin in the 80s or something like that, they want to maybe protect their tool a little bit. But I really don't think that comes up too much in the actual committee room. I think it's just the process is what it is.
You and I meet almost every time this time of year, almost every year, because I think people need education. Number one, about what bracketologists do. People know about you. They know about Lenardi. They know about Jerry Palm. They know about others. Bracketologists are not, let me not say what you are not. Tell us what a bracketologist does. You're attempting to kind of predict what the selection committee is going to do, not what they should do or which team you think is better. Did I say that correctly?
You did, yeah. And I would say from my standpoint, I think there might be varying answers if you interviewed every single person that does this, because I know there are people that maybe are metrics focused, like our friend Eric Haslam, who does Haslametrics. Mm-hmm. He does bracketology, but it's all based on what he thinks it should be. He doesn't really care what the committee thinks. And there's people like that out there, and I think there's value in that, because especially if you're filling out a bracket, you can kind of see which teams are trending the right direction with a tool like his. But I think the large majority of us, my particular goal is I want to be able to provide the communities and the fans and whoever's associated with any program going to the tournament a realistic outlook of who they're going to play, where they're going to play, and be able to back that up with all the whys. And so in order to do that, you have to really ingrain yourself with the process. So I serve on 2 different mock selection committees. The first one last weekend with Tim Kruger from Stadium did a great job hosting that. A lot of really great bracketologists on that committee. And then this week with my old friends at Hoops HD, we do that every year. And the reason I participate in that is because I think it's really important for a bracketology, for a person putting out brackets independently. You need other people's opinions and know how these teams are going to get looked at and discussed. So I have to get out of my own head sometimes and listen to what other people think, and then, figure out what maybe a actual discussion in the committee room would go like. So each team I look at, I try to figure out what's the worst part about them, what's the best part about them, how do they compare to different teams, because that's ultimately how they're discussed. And I think sometimes that's lost on a lot of people that do this. I think they just look at the numbers, make a decision, and put it up there, and nothing wrong with that. I just think there's some realistic things that might be missing from some of those forecasts, and I try to make sure to cover every loose end that is possibly out there.
I just stuck up the name of your website there, Bracketeer.org. They can find out your great work there. Also, you and I talked before we came on. You've kind of jumped in and been connected with a group called Field of 68, and you guys have a kind of a bracketology show routinely. I think you're going to have one a little bit later today. But also tell us what you're going to be doing Sunday night. I think that's super exciting.
Yeah. So Field of 68, if you haven't heard of it, it's owned by, I believe, Rob Doster, formerly of NBC, and Jeff Goodman, formerly of ESPN. They've done a really good job through the pandemic to serve college basketball fans with all sorts of content. They have an After Dark show as well that comes in on satellite radio and is live on YouTube and Twitter. Our shows are usually Mondays and Fridays, but this week we're doing more. And Selection Sunday will do that special. Glad you brought that up. Where I'll be on there with one other bracketologist, and I'm sorry, I don't even know who I'm going to be with yet. I just know I'm on there so far. But we did it last year, and we react live to all the selections, and that's actually a fascinating process because I came prepared for that last year, and I basically had a list of all the teams, so I'm crossing them off as they announce them. And I think my favorite part was when we got down to the last region, and I realized certain teams weren't going to get in. There wasn't a spot for them. And then other teams a little surprised at where they landed seed wise. So some of that stuff before they announce it, if you like to just kind of pick our brains and see how we're reacting, it's kind of unique. And, for all those that are diehard and love this process, it's a good show for you.
That'll be a lot of fun. That's Sunday night while the live show is going on CBS. These guys will be reacting online after the announcements, maybe each bracket or each 8-team group or whatever it might be. So do that. Field of 68. It's a great site. I get on that email every day and look at things that they're producing there. It's terrific. You have your number 1 seeds, Alabama, Houston, Kansas, Purdue. Not a shock for any of those. And they've had great seasons. After you get past the first, 8, 9, 10, 12, is that when it starts to get difficult?
Well, I think the top 16, there's a little bit more of a structure just based on the fact that we had the bracket preview show from the real committee on February 18th. And we will, this is the shortest amount of time, Harry, that we've seen the show take place, that preview show. They've done it for 6 years now. And the actual Selection Sunday, which is March 12th, 2 days away. There was only about 3 weeks worth of basketball between the 2 dates. So most of the teams, it's really hard to move them up or down too much because we already have an idea of how the committee views them. We might have a situation with Baylor where they lost twice to Iowa State in the last week. Do they move off the 2 line and onto the 3? I would think if we were starting fresh, it would be very tempting to move like a Gonzaga, who looked very dominant in their last 2 wins over St. Mary's and all their other games, to go up to a 2 seed. But I think we know now that Gonzaga started from the 15 position overall, one of the lower 4 seeds just 3 weeks ago. It's really hard to move them all the way up 2 seed lines. I think most of us feel comfortable just leave them as a 3. So a lot of those types of decisions you have to hedge more than others, just based on the fact that we have a really good idea of how they were thinking about these teams just 3 weeks ago. So I think after that, it really the 5 seed line is where things start to get a little more difficult, because then it's up to speculation.
Because then you have to predict who's going to lose in that first round. Because fives always lose to 12s. I get it. Hey, I wanted to ask you. All these the larger conferences are having their conference tournaments this weekend.
Yes.
And it occurs to me, or it would be logical to me, to say that these tournaments don't mean a lot in terms of those seedings or making it, other than winning the tournament, because they can't cram all that information in right at the last minute. Am I right about that? That seems logical to me. That doesn't mean I'm correct.
Yeah, I think a lot of us had to learn that the hard way a year ago, Harry. I think nothing more obvious than the SEC tournament, where Texas A&M, I think everybody would agree they were on the outside looking in at the start of the week. But in that week, they had tremendous wins. They beat Arkansas in the semifinals to get to the championship. Played 4 days, excellent basketball. And if you reassess their resume at the end of Saturday night last year, the night before the show, I think it's very clear that they not only belonged in, but maybe even belonged above going to Dayton in the first four. And of course, we know now Texas A&M was not included. They weren't even in the first couple of teams out. And Tennessee, the team that won that event, they had a stellar resume. I think pretty clear that they should have been the last 2 seed. Still was a 3 seed below Duke. Duke, a team that lost to Virginia Tech on that Saturday. So again, they basically just diluted. The only way you could really explain it is if you go back, and even you could look at my website that Saturday morning. My actual bracket forecast Saturday was more accurate than my one on Sunday, just because I had done some tweaking. So I'm probably not doing that this year. I'm probably rolling with whatever I got tomorrow, unless we have bid steal scenarios. Oregon could win the Pac-12 tournament. There's some others out there. Conference USA is really up for grabs, and only one team's guaranteed getting in. But besides that, I think I'm going to be playing it safe in a lot of these decisions based on what happened last year. And not only that, Harry, I think more years than not, if you look at the last decade or more, they tend to wrap up their process earlier and earlier for whatever reason. I know after last night, that's probably the last real big day that you can take into account before you start, applying the bid steals that could come up tomorrow.
Yeah, it's amazing all the stuff they have to factor in, the numbers, the eye test, and all those kinds of things. And they're real humans. They're not just computers cranking out data. I want to talk about where teams end up and how they end up being matched up. Southeast Missouri just won the Ohio Valley Conference tournament. All the bracketologists are saying they're going to be at Dayton. They might be playing a different team based on different bracketologists. But like you mentioned, I think in your site today that they had to play a certain team because once they got down the road a little bit, they had to avoid Missouri and somebody else because it was a rematch or something like that. There's a whole lot of stinking stuff those guys have to think through, and you have to think through to put out your bracket.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see how that plays out. So 2023, it's actually a new policy. And again, I think it's not one of the stricter policies, but they are trying to avoid rematches in the second round, not just the first round. The first round rematches, that's been a rule for a very long time. And, I think it makes it more exciting when you get to play a different team, and even if you do it in the whole first weekend. So I like where their head's at by putting that in. I think it's going to help a lot with some of the other parts of the bracket where you have second round matchups where you don't want to see the same 2 teams play again. But here in their case, they'll have to play, of course, a game in Dayton before they would even have a shot to knock off the number 1 seed.
To play Purdue in your bracket, yeah.
Right, Purdue in mine, yeah. So if you I don't know how seriously they're going to take it in the committee room, just based on the fact that it's 16's only beaten a 1 seed once. But as long as they're following the rules, which is what I'm doing, then that would be where Southeast Missouri, because right now I have both Missouri, the Tigers, and Iowa, the Hawkeyes, as 8 seeds. So they would technically need to avoid that pod. And so that kind of shuffled the Red Hawks around, and they got next to Purdue.
So people accuse the committee every year of Jimmy and rigging the system so that there's a cool storyline. Like, for example, Matt Painter and Brad Korn, the head coach at SEMO, have connection, because so many of the Matt Painter and those guys were Purdue guys, and Korn was with those same guys at Southern Illinois. And so there's the story. You have Iowa State and Drake playing each other in the opening round. So, little brother gets to play big brother. If it comes out like that on Sunday night, people all over America are going to say, yeah, see, they're rigging. They want cool storylines. Does that enter into that committee's brain at all?
No, not necessarily. Especially in a game like that. The only thing I tend to have a little bit of skepticism is, I do think perhaps like the Duke, Carolina, Kentucky, maybe a handful of those big time blue blood schools, they might be a little bit more cautious with. Again, that's speculation, so that's not fair to put out publicly like fact. But we do see sometimes those teams get taken care of a little bit extra, just from looking at it from afar, not being in the actual room. But I think a matchup like Drake Iowa State, that's just going to come together, by chance, and that's how it happened for me. Iowa State right now is my top 5 seed. So out of all the 5 seeds, they're in the pecking order first. And so once you have your seed list built, all 68 teams are ranked 1 through 68. You get to the 5 seeds and you really just go, and that's an interesting part of the bracket, because after you get through the top 16, then you start going sub-region first instead of the overall regional. And Albany just ends up being the closest available site, because it's pretty much all Albany. And I think there's one for Greensboro, and then there's another one for Orlando. So from Iowa, the Albany site makes the most sense. And so Iowa State went there as their first choice. And you get down to the 12 seeds. And right now, my order is Charleston, Oral Roberts, and then Drake. But out of those 3 schools, Drake, of course, is the furthest north by quite a ways. And it makes sense to put them in Albany. And that's just where they just happen to be matched up with Iowa State. The only reason it happened, it's not because I'm trying to make up a matchup or anything. So that could easily happen with the real committee if it stays in this pecking order, for sure. Iowa State, I would say, still has an outside chance of playing their way into the 4 seed line, especially since they're still alive.
Drake is there's a sub-regional in Des Moines. I'm going to go there next week, and obviously they won't send the Bulldogs to their home city.
Right.
So talk to me about, so Bradley is not going to be an NCAA tournament team. No. They were a low 50s net team before. I don't know where they are today, but they were a low 50s team before they lost to Drake last week. And so we were talking about those net numbers earlier. A team like Bradley has to, again, I don't want to make the net the gold standard, but a team like Bradley has to be what, in the 30s, 40s, 20s to make the tournament?
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the net is more there to sort your data. Now, obviously, if you're a school like Bradley, you don't get the opportunities that power schools get. You're having a nice net, maybe top 30 or 40 would get you maybe looked at more. But I think it's always about your body of work. And, they can just as easy as they can see your net ranking, they can see your quad records as well. And they can see all your other metrics as well. So, for me in the bubble area, I have 18 different categories I can see at one time on all teams and just do straight comparisons. And I think if I have that and I built it on my own, I can't imagine what kind of technology they have in the room, because I've heard the system is really easy to use. I think this is all scrutinized and looked at closely. Liberty's a team that was ranked in the top 35 in net for a while, but they had no wins. And so I didn't really care how high they got in the net. They weren't going to get in. So it always comes back to the same thing that almost every single committee chairman has said publicly on television, which is, who did you play? Where did you play? And how did you do? And I think especially when it comes to getting the right 36 at-large teams, you have to ask that question on every single one over and over and over again. And this is not an easy bubble this year either. So I think, that's everything I do. I'm trying to guess what they're doing. It's not necessarily my own opinion, but that's the question I keep asking myself. Who did the most damage? And typically it comes down to who did the most damage away from home, because everybody's good at home.
And that is something of what those quad numbers do tell us, correct? I mean, that really, when I was looking at the Missouri Valley teams, for example, they just had no chance, meaning their quad, they didn't have enough quad one opportunities. Even the championship game at the Valley tournament last week was two teams in the 50s. So they were both playing a quad two game, which is great, but it's not a quad one game. So it wasn't going to move them much. And talk about this process. I told somebody, I said, well, maybe I put it on Twitter. I said, I'm going to have Rocco on and ask him if every team from the Big 12 is going to make the tournament. Every team from the Southeastern Conference is going to make the tournament. Clearly, they're not. But
No.
People that are following the teams I'm following, they just think there's this massive bias for those teams of the power conferences, and obviously they have more opportunities, and so there is that unfair advantage. But it's what it is, And so, tell my Missouri Valley friends and Ohio Valley friends why it's not an unfair advantage for fill in the blank SEC school. And by the way, hey, Missouri, what a year. We're I live here in St. Louis, happy for the Tigers.
Yeah, great year. They definitely overachieved. They picked up some great wins that gets them in as a lock right now. So it's amazing to see in Coach Gates' first year, a guy I covered at Cleveland State last year. So really happy for them. But yeah, in general, I can totally understand where that perspective comes from, because I think I'm more of a mid to low major guy at heart first. And I try to look at it through their eyes. I think there's so many unbelievable stories to tell. I think there's typically older, more cohesive teams at the mid and low major level, even if they don't have lottery picks or guys that go to the NBA. They play super well as a team, and they're fun to watch, and they can really overachieve. And I get that's where the frustration in the Valley sits. I also think within the net system, it does make it really difficult for, you look at like an Ohio State team that they were ice cold for 2 months and they still couldn't fall out of quad one. We see an example like that out of the Big Ten. It seems like every year. A couple of years ago, Penn State had like 6 games under 500 and still in the top 45. So I mean, that's pretty frustrating, because some of those teams are teams that their season's pretty much dead, and you're still giving teams credit from a quad perspective. And I hope that committee members look at it the way I've tended to look at it, which is try to ignore the numbers next to the name and look at the actual name and know which teams are going to be in the tournament and which teams are clearly not going to be in the tournament. Then you can start to weed out all the extra fluff of quad one, or the extra, or maybe you'll find a good win down in like bottom of quad two, because, somebody like Pittsburgh or Wisconsin was buried down there. You'll find that stuff if you do your due diligence. So my biggest mystery with it all is how deep do they go? And I hope they at least go as far as I go, because then you can actually see right through that stuff, and it's not as big of a deal. But I do feel for the Valley and the fans, because in the old RPI system, they would have been afforded probably more a chance to be a multi-bid than they are now. I won't disagree with that, but I do think it's good that the quad system set up to favor road wins. If anything, they need to tweak it even further, because I'll tell you a stat, Harry, and it kind of blows my mind. Out of all quad ones in the quad one wins this year for the whole country, if you added them all up, over half of those, over double of those happened on home courts. Wow. Only less than half that amount happened on a road court. Just shows that even though they've made a big difference between road and home, they haven't made as big of a difference as they need to, because road wins are gold. And so if you have them, it makes a huge difference.
Before we let you go, where do you think the most volatility is within your bracket heading for Sunday? What I mean is, what's the thing that's going to, whoa, I didn't see that happening, or something happens today or tomorrow in one of those conference tournaments that does make a big shift?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think right now there's 6 spots. The last 6 spots, if there's no stolen bids, are very difficult. I think there's reasons to be concerned for most of the teams I have there now. So today, it's not on the site yet, but it will be. The list of those teams are Providence, Pittsburgh, Arizona State, Utah State, NC State, and Rutgers, who just got eliminated. And so I have them all getting in. The order of those are up for debate still, from my perspective. I'm very concerned about both NC State and Providence. Providence, I think a little bit of an edge just because they've got 3 marquee wins, but they were all at home. NC State, the more I look at them, the more it hurts my stomach. They've just got nothing on the road that was. They got Virginia Tech and Wake Forest road wins, not tournament teams, and they have so many chances. And they lost 3 times to Clemson, who's not going to get in my opinion. So on the outside, I think there's enough evidence to knock out Nevada and Wisconsin. So I would be surprised if you see either of those names get in. Oklahoma State is a really interesting one. Obviously playing in the Big 12, they had 16 games against teams that will be in the field, and they only won 4 of them. To me, you win 25% of those opportunities. That's not good enough. So I think they should be out. But again, if any of those 3 get in, I'm going to have to revamp my own criteria. And then a real wild card here for me, and I can't see them getting in, but I would be so happy if they got in. It would be North Texas as an at-large. Their net is up to 36. They don't have a quad 1 win, so I don't think it's going to really catch anybody in the committee room to try to push for them. But obviously that program, I thought they belonged last year, and the way they're playing right now, they might just win that thing anyway. That would be a pleasant surprise.
I don't know about this team. I haven't looked at this team hard. Final question, and then I'll let you go. I know you got tons to do. Vanderbilt loses their center, Liam Robbins, to injury. And so fill in the blank team. They're a 7 seed. I'm making up the team. And their star or a star player gets hurt. Does the committee take that into account and say, oh, well, now they should be an 8. Now they should be a 9. Or no, their body of work says they're a 7. We're going to leave them there.
It matters. Yeah. They discuss it. In fact, on the bracket preview, a couple examples. One, after they released the top 16, they asked who would be the next teams in order. And they didn't give the order, but they gave it alphabetically. And 2 of the teams they listed were Creighton and TCU, both teams that have significant injury backgrounds. TCU's bad losses came when Mike Miles was out. Obviously, they're a great team when they're healthy. And Creighton lost 6 in a row when Kalkbrenner, he played a couple of those games, but he had mono and it's up for debate how effective he was in a couple of those losses.
St. Louis guy. We love him.
Yeah, he's great player and difference maker. So the committee already talked about that. And I think what they're most interested in is what are you going to bring to the dance when it comes to that? So if it's like Tennessee right now, Zakai Ziegler is done. And I think everything resume-wise and metrics-wise, you just leave Tennessee as a 3 seed where they had them before. We're going to get to see Tennessee play again today, so that should help a little bit. But that could be enough to where if they make the determination that Tennessee's not as good, they could easily drop them to a 4. There's all sorts of that conversation for seeding. But I do think when you're getting down to those last spots, you've just got to make the right decision for what they've earned. And then seeding's a whole different conversation. And that's why I think a team like Pittsburgh, even though they're in my last 6 there, I think they belong because they did do the most road damage out of all those teams. But you could easily start to slot them down towards the bottom once you've got them in. And that's why the Panthers could very well land in Dayton.
It's Rocco Miller, Bracketeer.org. You can also hear him on that Field of 68 show later today and probably tomorrow and for sure on Sunday night. Hey, we really appreciate your time in the midst of your busiest time of your life and squeezing us in. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Harry. I appreciate it. It's fun to come on with you.
That's Rocco Miller, Harry Schrader with you, ValleyHoopsInsider.com. Remember, since you've been there, make it a better place. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we will be talking to you all throughout next week. Have a great day.